The ongoing Boscali Primevan War, a war that has become somewhat characterised by its rather liberal use of nuclear weapons, as well as other highly technological pieces of equipment and weaponry. But of course, it was not always like that. In the earliest days of the war, air battles in particular were fought in a rather old-fashioned way, with the use of cheaper, more basic aircraft, very close-range missiles, as well as cannons and guns. The more advanced jets, as well as the much more valuable strategic assets, including the stockpiles of nuclear weapons, were available at the start, but in much smaller numbers. And so as war loomed on the horizon, huge numbers of TA-30 compasses and CI-22 crickets were built up and stockpiled near the borderlands, together with high numbers of chicane attack helicopters. All of these assets were used by both the belligerent nations, of course making for a particularly high attrition rate, as neither side had any type of airframe that would give them a particularly noticeable advantage over their adversary. The first major battle of the war in the air took place between squadrons of both sides deploying from forward ad hoc air bases. Straight pieces of highway that had been converted into forward operating bases as war loomed on the horizon. When combat operations started, both sides deploying aircraft as well as ground forces attempted to knock out the opposing forces' forward operating bases, each side claiming the other were the aggressor and that they were acting in self-defense. The skies very quickly became overcrowded with aircraft, with eyewitness claiming that to watch the battles from the ground reminded them of the murmuration behaviour of starlings, or shoals of fish as they coalesce in large groups, swarming around. And believe it or not, the highest scoring kill weapon in this battle, this first battle, wasn't some highly advanced air-to-air missile, but was in fact the rather common cannon or machine gun, whilst guided air-to-ground missiles were used for taking out enemy ground forces, most predominantly the AGM-48. But the vast majority of weapons expenditure was in the air combat, which raged on very bitterly for quite some time. Everywhere one looked, planes were on fire, falling out of the sky, or firing their air-to-air missiles and guns in what appeared to be a somewhat panicked frenzy. Needless to say, the attrition rate was enormous, and a good many pilots were killed or badly wounded on that first day of combat. This battle also saw the first time that the VL-49 Tarantula was used in any sort of numbers, with the air forces of both sides deploying them in order to support their ground advance, airlifting troops and supplies forward in order to dominate the land battlefield, occupying important pieces of terrain like hillsides and the like. But the Boscali Defence Forces were deploying some Tarantulas with a new weapon. Still not officially in service, but rather in testing, a number of Tarantulas were deployed using a 76mm gun mounted on the side of the aircraft, firing guided shells. Able to shoot and remain on the move at a very long range to the target, this weapon would prove to be somewhat decisive in the race to destroy the opposing force's base, but ultimately the real victory belonged to the dozens of pilots fighting in the ongoing air-to-air battle, many flying a number of sorties, with many having to operate more than one aircraft, having been shot down, rescued, brought back to base and redeployed. Over the course of the day, pilots from both sides quickly learned the tricks for shooting down certain types of aircraft, especially at close range. For example, many pilots quickly learned the very real danger posed by a chicane's cannon when in range, and so a tactic was quickly adopted in which planes would carry out a peregrine swoop, or stoop as some would call it, diving upon a chicane from above, where the chicane's cannon could not be brought to bear. Due to the shocking high rates of attrition amongst pilots, many of the pilots that took part in the battle were actually those still in training, but in the later stages of their training. and some even found themselves commanding small sections of aircraft as they went into combat. This of course occurred on both sides of the fight as the battle became more and more desperate. As a matter of fact, many of these trainee pilots would find themselves ending the day as aces. Pilots from Revoker and Ifrit squadrons, as well as naval aviators tasked with flying the Vortex that recently had entered service, were of course beside themselves with envy upon hearing about the battle after the event. Many of them were of course quite furious that they had not been deployed for the battle. But as their numbers increased, their time would of course soon come. And in the end, the air battle began to thin out. Losses on both sides were such that the scramble to replace aircraft and pilots became ever more difficult. But ultimately, it was the Boscali Defence Forces that began to gain the upper hand, and the noose began to tighten around the Dust Bowl airship, the highway that had been converted into a forward operating base by the Pala forces. But right up until the end, they made it very difficult for the BDF, with pilot and aircraft losses continuing right up until the very end of the battle. And of course, as we now know, in the end, it was the Pala forces that withdrew first, abandoning the Dust Bowl highway airstrip, giving victory to the BDF. Thank you ever so much for watching this somewhat shorter than normal video. I really hope you enjoyed this little piece of player-made lore for the game Nuclear Option. I do hope to make more such videos like this, so if you do enjoy this sort of thing, please do subscribe, leave a like, and tell me what you think in the comments. Thank you once again for watching. Cheerio.